From everywhere beneath come the voices. Turkey is devastated by an earthquake. A refinery is engulfed in flames. A port is underwater. And tens of thousands are buried under rubble in one of the greatest natural disasters of the 20th century. This is the story of the heroic efforts of rescue volunteers and of the ominous warnings from scientists about a far greater disaster. Where Byzantine emperors once brandished the cross and crusaders waved the sword, there is now the cell phone. Everyone in Istanbul seems to have one. It's in the nature of the city to be connected. The place once called Constantinople links two continents. Across the Bosphorus, Asia. This side, Europe. It makes for a place of jolting contrasts. The contrasts find harmony in one place, Hagia Sophia, a microcosm of Turkish history. It was the largest Christian church in the world. Then, a mosque. Now, it's a museum. To scientist Ross Stein, it means yet something else.
To you, this might look like a Byzantine church or an Islamic mosque, but to me, it's a 1,300-year-old seismometer. And that's because the same structure has sat here all that time and has sustained one earthquake after another. We couldn't ask for anything more valuable in trying to assess the size and impact of all of these earthquakes.
During an earthquake, minarets can dance like the needles of a seismograph, which is what they did early in the morning of August 17th, 1999. The master control room of television network NTV. At 3 a.m., a talk show airs during the night shift. At the same moment, rescue volunteer Iskander Uduer was traveling by bus to his home in Istanbul. In a suburb of the big city, a young artist was cozy in her new apartment. Umur Kunay and her mother had moved to the concrete building just days before. Ross Stein was in Paris. For once, the geophysicist didn't want to hear about earthquakes. He wanted nothing to disturb his night out with his wife and friends. As the clock struck 3:02 a.m. in Turkey, a seemingly harmless sound awoke journalist Duygu Senem.
I thought it was just a hum, maybe some city workers doing repair jobs.
Security cameras all over Turkey suddenly went dead.
I woke up and felt the tremor. I ran directly to my mother. She was crying. And she said, "The house is collapsing."
The only thing I could think of was my son. I jumped out of bed yelling, "Burke!" My husband Alper held me down. "Okay, it's all over," I said. "This is the end of everything."
The building was trembling. Then I saw the wall explode. I said to myself, it's a bomb or a plane that crashed into the building.
The Erkmans couldn't reach their 6-year-old son trapped in the next room. They embraced each other. Seconds later, they too were trapped. Umur Kunay hugged her mother as their apartment buildings disintegrated on top of them.
When I opened my eyes, I could only hear the voices like, building collapsed. Come here, run.
The power was out all over northwest Turkey. The cell phones that Turks depend on were also useless. The network was overloaded. Few calls went through. No one knew how widespread the disaster was. The only news came from portable radios.
We knew there had been a major earthquake. The house shook for 45 seconds. That's serious business. How do you find out what's going on? Curiously enough, the way I knew was the neighbors all came rushing out of their house. They live in concrete houses. They sat on the steps of our house, the wooden house, and they had their radios with them.
There was a very small amount of information from one of the local radios, and when we discovered that the epicenter was not here, then we thought, God, it must be 10,000 people at least.
Among the first news was that of a monstrous blaze on the eastern horizon in a city called Izmit. Flames skied from the tanks of Turkey's largest oil refinery. The fire signaled the area that had been hit by the big quake. Extending 1,500 miles into the Mediterranean Sea is Turkey. It was the heavily populated northwest that had been devastated. From Adapazarı in the east to Avcılar, a suburb of Istanbul to the west. The epicenter was between the cities of Izmit and Gölcük. 2 years earlier, Ross Stein had co-authored a paper that pinpointed 2 likely locations for the next big Turkish earthquake. One was Izmit. Amazingly, Stein and 2 colleagues, Aykut Barka and Jim Dietrich, had foretold the epicenter of the quake.
It was an out-of-body experience to see this earthquake occur. It was something that made us feel maybe we had learned something about the way the earth worked, but we were aware of the terrible suffering that this was going to bring.
While traveling, rescue volunteer İskender Uder had felt the shaking. He hitched a ride to the hardest hit area.
Some people, like me, were already on the scene by coincidence. I was in Izmit and I started working right away with civil defense.
İskender was one of the leaders of Akut, a small club of mountaineers. In the coming days, the hopes of thousands of trapped victims would fall on the shoulders of these young volunteers. Throughout the world, other rescue teams were getting ready. In Fairfax County, Virginia, an elite U.S. team assembled. They are equipped with microphones so sensitive they can pick up the sound of a beating heart. Remote-controlled video cameras that can snake into tiny openings. Whether they would reach survivors in time was the big question. Some neighborhoods were so devastated that survivors were shocked when they saw the destruction.
I couldn't recognize my street. I've lived here for 15 years and yet couldn't recognize it. And people under the rubble were screaming. They were the screams of people whom I've lived with for so many years.
But the people of the stricken areas weren't entirely on their own. İskender Uder and the other volunteers became familiar sights at rescue scenes.
The worst part is some part of the casualty is trapped under the concrete block. The whole building just falls down and just sits on the leg or on the arm. This is the hardest part. I mean, you talk with him, but you cannot take him out because there's a huge concrete building, whatever, on his leg. Technically, it is possible to make an amputation inside there, but there should be a surgical team to do that.
Medical assistance was limited. Thousands of buildings had collapsed, so many of the early rescues just happened with whatever volunteers had available. At 6 a.m., a voice was heard from beneath the concrete. An hour and a half later, a woman was revealed. Cocooned perfectly in the debris was